Good evening. My name is Kate Hampton, and I work at the Montana Historical Society. And we're just so excited to see such a great turnout here tonight. Thank you so much for coming down to the library for our Thursday night lecture series. And this evening, I'm so excited to be able to introduce my good friend, Ken Robison, who's a chronicler of neglected Western history, a preservationist, and a historian at the Overholser Historical Research Center in Fort Benton. Ken is a trustee in the board of the trustees for the Montana Historical Society. And he has been honored as a Montana Heritage Keeper by the Society. Captain Robison served 29 years in naval intelligence during the Cold War, and he's the author or co-author of 16 books, including Cold War Montana, From Stolen Secrets to the Ace in the Hole, and the very newly published Historic Tales of Fort Benton, which is what he's going to talk about this evening. The talk tonight is A Hidden Tale, The Vigilantes and X Beidler of Fort Benton. The famed Montana vigilante story centers on Henry Plummer and X Beidler in Bannack and Virginia City in the early 1860s, but little has been known about the vigilante activity later in the 1860s in the booming and lawless riverport town of Fort Benton. So we're going to learn much more about that this evening. It's always good to have a little mayhem in this Halloween season. So, and speaking of mayhem, I wanted to let you all know that please gather one of these on your way out this evening. We're having a decorated pumpkin contest at the original governor's mansion, so you can drop off your decorated pumpkins the day before Halloween on the 30th, and they'll be displayed at the OGM, and we will be doing trick-or-treating at the OGM on Halloween night from 5 to 7. So with no further ado, he's not in costume. He really dresses like that all the time. Here's my good friend, Ken.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, John. John Finn is an old friend from his reference room days at the Great Falls Public Library. I think right after I moved back from years away from Montana, I think he was part of the library staff, and it's great to see him with a fabulous meeting room and a great library. And I'm sure you're here not because of me, but because of my friends, the Fort Benton Vigilantes. Something about Vigilantes and X Beidler that can really draw a crowd. I know that your knowledge of the Vigilantes probably is equal to mine. It's all centered on Bannack and Virginia City and Henry Plummer and Wilberforce Sanders, the prosecutor, and X Beidler, the executive secretary, or rather the hangman. Those were fun days for the Vigilantes in the early 60s as Montana had a bout of order without law. And I've kind of adopted that term. But very little is known about the Vigilantes that were very active later in the 1860s, centered in Fort Benton. Jack Lepley and Joel Overholser, the longtime editor of the Fort Benton River Press, wrote a little bit about the Fort Benton Vigilantes, but frankly, they were hard-pressed to find very much about them. Let me get this thing going here. I knew I should have left it on. Anthony to the rescue. I do pretty well with computers, but the rest of the technologies. Thank you. So, despite their best efforts, they uncovered relatively little. They had one great story about Bill Hinson's hanging, and I'll be talking about that. But by and large, the Fort Benton Vigilantes have remained hidden under the secrecy that was imposed around there. And even more so, I don't know of anybody who's ever dug into X Beidler, John X Beidler's time and effort in northern Montana centered at Fort Benton because, again, he's an integral part of Bannack, Virginia City, and all that great early vigilante activity. And, he's got his detractors. He led a pretty uneven life, I think. But let me begin with a few words about my Historic Tales of Fort Benton, this new book. The great historian of the fur trade and of the upper Missouri steamboating, Hiram Chittenden, about 125 years ago, paid tribute to Fort Benton with these words: "Few, if any, towns in the far west country possess so unique and varied a history as Fort Benton. With the exception of some of the old Spanish villages in the southwest, it's the oldest settlement in the mountain country. The true historic character of Fort Benton did not embrace more than half a century. Yet in that brief space, it saw more romance, tragedy, and vigorous life than many a city 100 times its size and 10 times its age." Now that's quite a tribute. Remarkably, Chittenden was writing just a decade after the end of Fort Benton's steamboat period, and we're not talking steamboats tonight, but I've got to come back sometime and talk to you about that great steamboat period from about 1859 to 1890. Can you imagine a 300-foot or 250-foot steamboat coming all the way from St. Louis to Fort Benton on the Big Muddy? That's quite a tale. More recently than Chittenden, though, my really good friend, former writer for the Missoulian, Kim Brigham, wrote an article entitled "The River is Fort Benton." His article excels in presenting our past, present, and future. Kim wrote, "You can't eat history any more than you can feast on the curve of the Missouri River bluffs, changing by the hour in the prairie light. But if any town can sustain itself on the past, it's Fort Benton. History is a resource here. There are as many buildings dedicated to preserving and interpreting the past as there are bars. A startling fact for a town that once boasted to have the bloodiest block in the West," unquote. It's Fort Benton's historical renown that allow me to say, when tales are told, they speak of Fort Benton. So how do you tell tales flowing from Fort Benton's storied past? How do you select a dozen or so tales from the hundreds that tell the full story? My answer was to present a series of tales early in our history, with many of them featuring fresh research and analysis, and telling several new tales that had not been well told before. My quest brought to the forefront some hidden gems of early Fort Benton when nearly invisible vigilantes brought order without law during the wild and woolly days of the Bloodiest Block in the West and the Hoodoo Block. What was nightlife really like inside the cosmopolitan Madame Dumont's elegant establishment in the Bloody Block? After the shocking and mysterious death of her hero husband, how did Libby Marr survive the rocky, near-tragic steamboat ride from Fort Benton late in the season while saving children's lives along the way? I sought new tales of Fort Benton as a frontier settlement and a multicultural melting pot with an astonishing mix of native wives with white traders, biracial marriages and children, African Americans and Chinese. Tentacles from these multicultural societies extended to the survivors of the tragic Baker Massacre of 1870, and to the exile of remarkable Louis Riel, a mystical blend of Mahatma Gandhi and John Brown and his Métis and Cree followers. Hanged in 1885, yet today a Canadian national hero. I determined these were tales I needed to tell. This evening, though, let me share a portion of the Vigilantes and Beidler tales from my book. While the books about the Vigilantes are centered on those gold mining years early in the decade, and they could the books and articles that have been written could likely fill the hold of a steamboat, and that's a big cargo capacity. But why is it that no one has written much or shared much or knows much about those vigilantes later in the 60s that centered at Fort Benton? Was it because there was no order without law, no frontier justice? Or did the vigilantes impose greater secrecy? Of course, there was no editor Dinsdale, and there certainly was no Montana Post in Fort Benton in the 60s. In fact, Fort Benton didn't get a newspaper until 1875, and by then the Bloodiest Block was being tamed by the presence of white women, among other reasons. Certainly there was little legal law and order during the 1860s, and during the spring and early summer steamboat season, Fort Benton was among the liveliest and most lawless towns in the West. The Bloodiest Block was booming day and night with an intensity far beyond the reaches of most law and order in any form. The office of sheriff featured a revolving door with a dozen sheriffs serving Choteau County between 1862 and 1870, and if my math is correct, that's about a sheriff and a half every year. That's pretty remarkable. And often those sheriffs were off in the hoop-up country across the border in Canada, and that's from about 1869 through 1874. And even after 1870, for the next 4 years, and this was the center of the hoop-up period, there were 4 sheriffs, 1 every year. And again, they were mostly across the border trading with the Kainai and the Sitka and the other tribes. The first word I found of a vigilance committee at Fort Benton appears in Deputy Indian Commissioner Hiram Evans Upham's report of February 2nd, 1866 to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. Upham wrote from Fort Benton, "Remember that town was just 3 years old at the time. The trading post was a couple decades old, but the town was just beginning to form." Upham wrote, "The white men on the bottom," meaning Fort Benton, "have lately organized themselves into a kind of vigilance committee for self-protection against both Indians and whites. All Blackfoot war parties have heretofore made a practice to stop here on their way to and from the enemy's camp." You have to understand there's a natural ford in the Missouri River right at Fort Benton, so the Blackfoot on their way to the Judith and to the Muscle Shell would pass through Fort Benton. Thus, from early on, Fort Benton had a vigilance committee for protection against both white and native lawlessness. And in the face of such an environment and in the absence of legal law and order, vigilante justice happened in secrecy under societal surface. In some cases, the presence of a local committee is reflected by just a hint, such as a letter from a traveler to Fort Benton in the Montana Post in June 1866, describing a vigilante poster prominently displayed in town. Unfortunately, this thing goes off in between uses. There it is. I think. Looks like it's on. Oh.
Nope. Okay. I go too far?
There we are. I'll have to use it more often. This organization has a branch at Fort Benton, we presume. This is the letter to the Post. For a neatly written little poster conveying the following terse and significant warning to belligerents. Beware, the Vigilance Committee is in session. Be warned of the earnestness of the careless use of firearms by order. The good folks of Benton, it seems, are determined to have law and order and peace among themselves at all hazards and are prepared to maintain it themselves until civil law shall afford them protection from the acts of the lawless. This warning poster appeared at the very time that the steamboat Luella under Captain Grant Marsh arrived at the Fort Benton levee in mid-June 1866. Captain Marsh's biographer, Joseph Hansen, describes the environment in the riverport and an incident aboard the Luella that triggered vigilante action. Quote, at the time of Captain Marsh's first arrival, the feeble arm of the new territorial government had not yet gained strength to reach from Virginia City to Fort Benton, and here the Vigilance Committee still ruled supreme. The men composing it did not meet in formal conclave to debate the punishments of a suspected offender. A few low words spoken in passing as they met each other on their daily business, a vote taken in the same manner, and perhaps the next morning a still figure would be found hanging by the neck from one of the stores, or some hulking individual would have disappeared from his familiar haunts, never to return. Fled in the night from a grim warning he had not dared to question or resist. The law of the Vigilance Committee was stern and uncompromising, but it was seldom unjust, for even the extremity of its punishments found excuse in the chaotic conditions of the frontier society. In Fort Benton, so great had become the terror inspired by its constant menace of swift vengeance upon evil doing, that Captain Marsh saw men ride into town from the mines, fling down their saddles with sacks of gold dust tied to the cantles upon the floor of Carroll and Steele's store, and go away for a week's spree, only to find when they'd sobered up and returned that their property had not been touched. While the Luella was unloading, one of her deckhands stole from the cargo a box of patent medicine, doubtless because it contained, you can guess, a large percentage of alcohol. In some way, the vigilantes found out about that. The miscreant was tried by one of the mysterious tribunals, and the next night was seized and borne away to a secluded spot where he was whipped until nearly dead. The captain afterward was informed that the Vigilance Committee had come within 3 votes of returning a verdict for hanging the thief, but the punishment accorded was sufficient and no more petty pilfering occurred on board the Luella. The great artist Andy Thomas kindly allowed me to use his dramatic scene of Fort Benton's Bloodiest Block on the cover of my book. He calls it Steamy Night at Madame Dumont's, and Andy has captured the action when the night turned violent in the volatile mix of alcohol, ladies, and gambling. The colorful Madame Dumont, better known as Madame Mustache, has one of the tales in my book, and I find a kinder and gentler nature to her than most historians do. Joe Culbertson, son of Fort Benton's founder, Alexander Culbertson and Nottawista, wrote that he lived in Fort Benton from the late 60s until 1872, when he relocated with his father to Fort Browning, further down the Missouri. Joe wrote about the Vigilantes' activities, noting that their headquarters in Fort Benton was the store of Matthew Carroll and George Steele. Here's how he described the environment at Fort Benton at the time. Fort Benton was one of the toughest places outside of hoop-up country that there was in the territory of Montana. It wasn't unusual to have 1 or 2 killed every other night in Fort Benton. Now, he's exaggerated that slightly. Front Street was all saloons except 3 log trading stores, including Carroll and Steele, the headquarters for the Vigilantes. I was living in Fort Benton when Bill Hinson, marshal for Fort Benton, dug his own grave, bought his own rope for the Vigilantes to hang him. Beidler, Vigilante, planned this necktie party in 1868. More of the Hinson story later. Beidler, a living Montana legend from Vigilante days, turns up often at Fort Benton, yet his fame came during the Vigilante cleanup of the mining camps that we've talked about earlier. The short and stocky 32-year-old Pennsylvanian was executive secretary or hangman of the Vigilantes. And let me just mention, for those of you that don't know this, but one of his famous acts during that Vigilante period was during the George Ives trial, the first of the Plummer gang to be hanged. X turned to a hesitant crowd during that trial, and he shouted, "Ask him how much time he gave the Dutchman." And of course, the Dutchman was Nick Thibault, who'd been killed for a few dollars in gold dust and his employer's mules. Beidler's first known visit to the head of navigation was in 1865 during the Blackfoot Treaty, peace treaty negotiations. You may recall the mule and mountain howitzer event during that time. Then there was an idiotic stampede to the Sun River in the years end 1865-66. Beidler was among the would-be miners who was helped with food and shelter during a very, very nasty winter, when many of them would have died except for help from Chief Little Dog of the Pagans and others. Beidler, in the late summer of 1866, was in charge for a Helena bank of several $1 million in gold hauled to Fort Benton by wagon. X reported that the dust was divided into 3 safes, each aboard a wagon drawn by mules. In Fort Benton, the safes were loaded on board the steamboat Luella, the same one as I've been talking about with Captain Grant Marsh, piloting the Luella down the Missouri River through water barely 2 feet deep with a cargo of 2.5 tons of Confederate Gulch gold dust, conservatively estimated then at $2.25 million. Today that'd be something like $46 million. This was the richest single cargo ever to go down from Fort Benton, and Beidler guarded that gold dust through all the dangers on its way from the mines to the Luella. In an eloquent graveside funeral oration, the famed vigilante prosecutor Wilberforce Sanders paid homage to the legendary Beidler, the man who, he said, had done more for 2 decades bringing law and order to the Montana frontier than any other pioneer. On January 23rd, 1890, X. Beidler died in his room in the Pacific Hotel right here in Helena. Days later, Saunders spoke of the time in the 1850s when young Beidler joined the abolitionist crusade of John Brown in Bleeding, Kansas, as slave owner and anti-slavery crusaders, jayhawkers, and bushwhackers fought a bloody rehearsal for the Civil War. In a skirmish, X was shot and left for dead on the field. The wounds he received lamed him for life. Sanders followed X's travels to western Kansas, which then became Colorado, and on to Bannack in then Idaho Territory. In June 1863, and then arriving in Alder Gulch, where in December Saunders prosecuted, and X hanged that murderer George Ives I'd mentioned before in Virginia City. Through his years as Deputy U.S. Marshal, X. Beidler ranged widely throughout Montana Territory, both as Marshal and Collector of Customs. Frequently and for extended periods, Fort Benton was the base of his operation, taking X north across the Hoop-Up line, across the Medicine line, into Hoop-Up country, east down the Missouri River to the Dakota border, west into Blackfoot country, and onto the streets and into the saloons of Fort Benton. Beidler's name appears in other tales in my collection as he chased criminals of all kinds and participated in major events centered on Fort Benton. Through X's many years as Deputy U.S. Marshal, Sanders professed he accepted all danger that came into his path and willingly accepted the consequences, whatsoever they might be. During a few seasons, he was in the employment of transportation companies engaged at great peril in taking treasure that was produced in Montana to the steamboats, as I mentioned, with that mammoth cargo down to the Luella. And he has had his individual possession and confided to his honor for protection millions upon millions of gold, Saunders emphasized. He has never betrayed a trust, and in the presence of this audience, which were the sons of, or the Montana pioneers, I believe I can confidently appeal to them to say that he never said of any human being an unkind word. X was confirmed as Collector of Customs for Montana and Idaho territories in April 1867. There had been no boundary survey. Nobody knew where the border was between Canada and the U.S. So Beidler came to Fort Benton to consult Alexander Culbertson. They loaded trade merchandise on a couple of wagons and headed north up the Hoop-Up Trail. Up around the Belly River, Culbertson opined the party was now on the British side of the border, and of course indeed they were, and they set up a trading post. X went on soon to find an infantry company from Fort Shaw and informed them they were on the wrong side of the border. They turned back. Then he was taken prisoner by the Blackfoot, who discussed various ways to terminate his career before a friendly chief intervened. As deputy marshal, he continued efforts aimed at curbing the whiskey trade with the natives. In the fall of 1868, in that capacity, he turned up at the Pecuni trading post on Big Dry Creek on the Marias to close it because Canadians were owners, along with Liver-Eating Johnson and Bill Hamilton, who at that time was the sheriff of Choteau County. Operator at the post, Charles Price Hubbard, didn't appreciate the visit, and he wrote later that Beidler, quote, was so crooked he couldn't hide behind a corkscrew. Yes, X did have his detractors. Al Wilkins, many years later, recalled X as headquartering in Fort Benton in 1874 and said, "I've seen him toss a fruit can out in front of him, take a six gun in each hand, and keep the can rolling until both guns were empty." As Deputy U.S. Marshal, much of the time his duties were in northern Montana. And an 1884 diary exists showing he was at Mose Solomon's post on the Marias in January. The next month, he was in Fort Benton to witness a flood caused by an ice jam. He entertained the pilgrims in Fort Benton saloons with tales of the earlier days. In May, during one of the chilly spring storms, X started the conversation rolling with, "Boys, did you ever hear or see a winter set in as early as this in the spring?" Others, probably Todd, barkeep at the time, among them, picked up the gambit until a few pilgrims regretted the impulse that had brought them to the growing Montana territory. And it's turned off again.
Keeps moving.
This is so annoying. And I'm sure you're annoyed too. Okay, it's finally on.
Great.
Thank you. The next year he brought Pike Landusky in from the Little Rockies and lodged him in the Choteau County Jail after Pike had attempted to kill his partner, Dutch Louis Meyer, co-discoverer of gold in the area of the Little Rockies. This image shows a portion of a page of the Steamboat Butte's passenger register that we have in our Fort Benton Research Center, with Beidler bringing a prisoner from Carroll to Fort Benton on the Butte. By mid-1880s, X fades from the Fort Benton picture, but let's return to the Billy Hinson hanging story of 1868. Organized by the Vigilantes and led by X Beidler, secrecy was so great that a half century passed before the full story emerged about this incident, and it was in the Conrad Independent in 1918 with the most intriguing headline: "Murderer who was Marshal of Fort Benton dug his own grave and bought his own rope with which the vigilantes hanged him." Old-timers who lived at Fort Benton in the 60s, few of whom are left today, used to indulge in a knowing smile whenever the name of Bill Hinson came up in conversation. For many years, the fate of Hinson was a subject that always provided much discussion and many arguments, but the solution of the mystery of his death and the strange circumstances surrounding it have never been published. The curious fact about Bill Hinson's death was that he erected his own gallows, dug his own grave, or at least superintended the digging of it, and bought the rope with which he was hanged. No other criminal or pioneer time did a victim of vigilante justice ever do more to assist in his own hanging. It was in the spring of 1868 that Bill Hinson came to Fort Benton from Helena, where he was suspected of having murdered China Mary and stolen something like $1,000 in gold from her. And he was known to be a robber in the Helena community. Beidler had tried to find evidence sufficient to convict Hinson of the Chinese woman's murder, but was unable to do so, and he was forced after a time to release Hinson. The latter soon left Helena, and he moved on to Fort Benton. So the following spring, the two met, Beidler and Hinson met on the streets of Fort Benton, when Beidler returned from Hoopa country. Hinson had undoubtedly intended to kill Beidler, but the latter accosted the murderer in the street and bluffed him out. And Nathaniel Langford, in his great book, The Vigilante Days and Ways, has a detailed account of this encounter between Beidler and Hinson on the streets of Fort Benton, and it's in the book, but I'll leave it out tonight. As night watchman, Hinson committed many crimes of thievery and appropriating valuables that came into his possession as an officer of the law. Hinson was suspected of crimes, but he was always shrewd enough to act without leaving evidence that might convict him. However, Beidler and the better citizens of Fort Benton watched and waited. On the morning of August 18th, a Fort Benton businessman whose name has never been made public went to Hinson and with an air of mystery told him that there was a man who needed hanging that night in town, and that a party of prominent citizens had decided to quietly execute him. "Who's going to be the star of this hanging bee?" inquired Hinson with much interest. "Hush," said his informant. "I'm not at liberty to say, but we want you to be present and take part in the execution." Well, Hinson acquiesced willingly, for an enterprise of this character was greatly to his liking. "Say," he suggested, "let me get the rope." "You go right ahead." "Oh, let me get the rope, select the place, and have the grave dug, and I'll have everything fixed for tonight." The other man smiled and said, "All right, Hinson, you go right ahead and make the arrangements. We want you to be right with us." Well, you get the drift of where this is going, and indeed, Hinson was hanged by his own rope and buried in the grave he dug. Now let's move on quickly to the Hoodoo Block. Not sure if many of you have ever heard of the Hoodoo Block. While Fort Benton gunfighters favored the saloons along the Bloodiest Block, a dark curse descended on the nearby Hoodoo Block, where all too many tragedies occurred. The curse of the Hoodoo Block lived on for many decades. It all began with the hanging of Billy Hinson, left swinging from the gallows that had been erected, he directed, into the next day before he was thrown in to rest his dark and evil soul in the grave he had prepared. The evil legend of the Hoodoo Block began that summer day, and the gallows were located on that block. At the time, the almost empty block featured a small log jail, the gallows, and a house built by a tough character, John B. Morgan, who was sheriff of Choteau County at the time. Morgan also dug a well near the house and built an adobe stable and corral to open a livery business. Shortly after Hinson's hanging, Sheriff Morgan's pagan wife died and their house burned down. No further details are known about those. About a month later, the Helena Herald reported another tragedy on that block. Our sheriff, John B. Morgan, died yesterday morning. This was November 14th, at 8 o'clock after prolonged illness, during 2 weeks of which he was confined to his bed. Scarcely a month passed since the burial of his wife. He leaves 5 children, all underage. I was told his disease was typhoid pneumonia. This was the report in the Herald. Over the next few years, the Hoodoo Block continued to earn its name as more tragedies befell it. In the summer of 1869, several wagons were attacked and 2 white men were killed by Indians thought to be Blackfoot, but later discovered to be Crow. This occurred about 15 miles from Fort Benton, and the residents were up in arms. At this critical time, a 14-year-old Blackfoot youth, the brother of powerful chief, Mountain Chief, rode into Fort Benton carrying dispatches from Major Culbertson. This boy and two of his companions were shot to death, and the bodies were tossed into the Morgan well. This practice continued for years, creating the legend of the Place of Skulls. On November 28, 1872, a soldier and two Diamondar mule skinners went on a drunken binge, threatening to ravish the town. They were arrested and locked safely in the jail before they could do harm to Fort Benton's property or citizens. The curse of the Hoodoo Block took over from there. At 3 o'clock the next morning, nearby residents awakened to smell burning logs and discovered the jail wrapped in flames. The first on scene concluded that the prisoners had broken out and then set fire to the jail. Yet once the building was reduced to ashes and had cooled off enough for the investigation to take place, in stirring the ashes, the charred skull and bones of a man were found, and this created the impression that all three of the prisoners had roasted alive. Further search found the remains of a second man in the ashes, but no portion of a third, although every particle of debris was carefully examined and re-examined. Buttons were found in the ashes which were recognized as belonging to the uniforms worn by the soldier and one of the prisoners. A belt identified as belonging to mule skinner Frank Thompson was found a short distance from the jail. This, coupled with the fact that no trace of a third man was found in the ashes, led to the conclusion that Thompson escaped after murdering his comrades. A search found no further clues or trace of Thompson. Adding to the mystery, I have to keep doing this. Adding to the mystery of it all, the Army commander at the infantry company at Fort Benton suppressed all information about the entire incident. The only reporting came from the 13th Infantry Regimental Headquarters at Fort Shaw. In later years, Ferdinand Roosevelt built a furniture store on the opposite corner in that block. When under construction, it blew down during a terrible storm, the only building in town affected. Roosevelt rebuilt, yet the next year the store caught fire, destroying his extensive inventory. That 1885 fire swept on to burn the newly built Oddfellows Hall on that block. The last chapter was written when the livery burned in an apparent final burst of evil energy, leaving the block empty except for the well-stocked Place of Skulls. The Hoodoo Block stood vacant until the old stories died, and in the early 1900s, new buildings went up, and in the words of historian Jack Lepley, old-timers agreed that the hoodoo had exhausted its powers of evil. Sanders eulogized Beidler, this man of brave heart, as he discharged every duty that necessitated every hardship. He was, in my view, the most unique and interesting character of our early history, according to Sanders. His courage amounted to the highest audacity. There were no risks that he was ever asked to take that he did not take and do with cheerfulness, the like of which is seldom known or paralleled. Through X's many years as Deputy U.S. Marshal, Sanders professed he accepted all danger that came into his path and willingly accepted the consequences. Sanders spoke of the good times and the bad that marked periods in the life of his great friend, concluding, "Now we're about to lay him in the beautiful valley near us and erect in bronze or marble a memorial of the gratitude of his neighbors and friends. where there shall be inscribed on its base, brave pioneer to true occasions, true. So, historic tales are varied, but I must admit that I was frustrated by my publisher's word limit, and so to overcome that, I have on my author website, Ken Robison, it's www.kenrobison.com, about 200 pages that you can access that the footnotes in the book will lead you to. So you can read about in much more depth in quite a number of the tales, especially that great tale that I haven't had time to explore with you this evening, but it's a tragedy, a Montana tragedy, and that's the Baker Massacre. I've been working with the Blackfoot to identify the survivors, and I know that Molly has a book coming out from the Montana Historical Society by Roger Henderson next year sometime that is apparently going to also cover aspects of the survivors as well as the whole Baker or Marias River Massacre. And of course, Paul Wiley did a wonderful job with his Blood on the Marias book. So with that plug for my website, I will, with Kate's help, open it up for questions. We'd ask you to let Kate get your question on the mic so that it is recorded for the broadcast. So.
Yes, so I'll come to you if you have a
Yes.
question. Yes, sir.
So a couple of photos earlier here, you had a picture of X. Beidler's grave, and there was some stuff on there, I can't remember, but something true, and I don't know what that meant. To true occasion true. What does that mean?
Well, what Sanders said doesn't quite agree with what made it on. What Sanders said was brave pioneer to true occasions true. That's what Sanders gave in his eulogy. This is what's actually out at Forestville.
Okay, thank you.
Which I intend to visit tomorrow.
That's right. Any other questions?
I grew up in Fort Benton. Where is the Hoodoo block? What buildings are there now, or do you know?
Yeah, if you go, you know where the highway bridge is, and then Front Street, and you go one block west, which is Main Street. It's that block from the highway bridge, or from the highway through town on north. It's that block right there. So today it's right in the center of town. It was a little bit further south than the original buildup of Fort Benton was kind of from the fort upriver from the fort, and so, and of course the Bloodiest Block in the west. If you're at the Grand Union, go down Front Street one block, and you'll arrive at the Culbertson House or the Pacific Hotel, and it's the block of the Culbertson House. Not very bloody today, fortunately. Any other questions?
Did Beidler have any children or any descendants that you know of, or was his lineage traced back to where he came from to see if there are still Beidlers today?
I'm sorry, Mary. Say it again.
Did Beidler have any children, or did he marry, or are there descendants anywhere?
Who?
Ex-Beidler.
Oh, he never married.
Okay.
I think in a lot of ways it was probably a fairly lonely, tragic life, but he certainly kept active. And considering the wound he suffered in Kansas, I think he did pretty well. And certainly Montana was the better for him, despite his detractors. Of course, there are detractors about Sanders and the rest of the early vigilantes too, and the revisionists want to rewrite that history. And that's why I think the new biography that, it's either a grandson, it must be a great-grandson of Sanders, Benjamin Sanders, has just come out with a book called Order Without Law. And boy, is that a great way to capture the situation. There was no order in those mining camps in those early years, and the same thing happened again in the Fort Benton area later in the decade. So sometimes I think vigilante activity was well justified in Montana Territory. Well, thank you all very much for coming. And
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Ken, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. You're such a good storyteller.